Hello everyone, this is Dr. Surasingha, and this is going to be my first lecture to you on endangered species. And this topic will cover consequences, causes, and the nature of rarity, um, with special references to endangered species. So, what do you mean by a rare species? Well, rarity can come in different forms, right? Endemic species. By definition, what is an endemic species? Endemic species are those that are geographically restricted to a certain area, right? A species that only occur in a particular geographical region is an endemic species, right? And particularly in here, we are looking at a very narrow, a limited, strict um, habitat specialization. So one example is this: you are looking at Venus flytrap. Um, it is considered to be it is considered vulnerable in terms of um, the red list global red list status, and it is currently petitioned for conservation in the Endangered Species Act, and it is also listed in the convention, the International Convention on Trade of Endangered Species, known as CITES. And Um, as you can see in its distribution range, let me get my mouse pointer over here. Um, as you can see over here, um, they're restricted to Carolinas, particularly to coastal Carolinas. And as you can see over here in the legend, um, they actually had much more broader historical distribution all the way spreading into South Carolina, but currently their distribution is kind of shrinking and mostly occurring in North Carolina. And even within North Carolina, we kind of see their population is in decline, or rather the distribution range is in declining. So indicating that they're actually becoming much more of a narrower endemic than it historically used to be. Um, so Venus flytrap, this particular species of plant, has become so much restricted for many reasons. It's dependent on areas that has a high water table, where the water table is so high that it actually often connects to the surface water and requires thick organic soil, and the hard pan has to be actually about 60 centimeters deeper, right? And a hard pan is actually a hardened impervious layer, typically made out of clay, that occurs below the surface topsoil. um, and that kind of a hard pan actually prevents water drainage and kind of can impair plant growth. So Venus flytrap kind of occurs in these kind of unique environmental conditions that seemingly not favorable for establishment of other plants because of the waterlogged condition. But it seems like Venus flytraps does better in waterlogged soil that is rich in organic matter overlying hard pan and with at least 60 centimeter ish soil depth. Okay, and also should be in close proximity to a high water table. It's kind of interesting. You need to have a hard pan plus a high water table. Again, that kind of combinations are quite rare because the hard pan itself prevents groundwater movements back and forth between surface water, right? So the hard pan itself should also create some sort of a perched water table in order to satisfy habitat requirements of Venus flytrap. And also there are other stricter habitat requirements. Their pH has to be slightly acidic, right, ranging between 3.9 to 4.5. That's a fairly narrower range, and it's also fire dependent, meaning its growth, establishment, and population persistence is dependent on recurrent fire. Now, you should know now that at this stage, that in North America, as much as in other parts of the world, particularly in the Eastern North America, fire has been suppressed for a very long time, right? So which is a very important disturbance that is no longer happening particularly in the southeastern United States, unless some of the federal or state agencies intentionally prescribe fire as a habitat management tool. And also there are some collection problems. It's a pretty charismatic plant. It's actually, like people collect it, for horticultural and variety of other purposes. I'm not sure how well it survives, right? Particularly given the very specific habitat requirements that you already have heard of. I suspect that it doesn't survive that well in ex situ environments. And what are the other forms of endemism? That's actually this is Venus flytrap is one of them. Island endemics or island inhabitants are also range restricted. So species that occur in oceanic islands, particularly. I mean, if you think about most of the oceanic islands in the world has several endemic species. In the US, you can think about Hawaii. There are certain freshwater fish that are endemic to Hawaii. Those Hawaiian honey creepers are endemic birds that underwent adaptive radiation in Hawaiian Islands, across Hawaiian Islands. And then if you look at Pacific Southwest or Central Pacific, there's a huge array of islands, Micronesian, Polynesian islands that actually harbor extremely high level of diverse vertebrates with very high degree of endemism. If you look at Madagascar, it's an African island, located off the eastern coast of Madagascar, eastern coast of Eastern Africa. Off the eastern coast of Eastern Africa, Madagascar has a very high diversity for birds and mammals, particularly among mammals. Then if you move into Southeastern Asia and South Asia, you have these Indonesian and Malaysian islands and Indian subcontinental islands like Sri Lanka, Andaman, Nicobar, with an extremely high degree of endemism among amphibians and reptiles. So those oceanic islands, are actually hotspots for rare species, because the species that are occurring in those oceanic islands have undergone isolation, reproductive isolation, over centuries. I mean, sometimes millennia, or sometimes even longer, for thousands of years, for not over like over thousands of years, over millions of years, right? They have been geographically isolated from their ancestral populations, from ancestral stock. So they have undergone many genetic modifications post isolation, so they actually have become island endemics, right? And if those islands are smaller, right, they actually their rarity kind of extenuates. Similar situation happens in inland environments. Okay, mountain peaks, right, that are surrounded by drier, arid climates also acts like an oceanic island, right? In this case, the mountain peaks, top of the mountain, are colder climatic environments, particularly of which the biome could be analogous to tundras. In fact, we are looking at alpine tundras, right? And the lower elevations of the mountains and the underlying valleys, could be actually dry, arid, desert-like environments. The best example exists here in the United States, right? Particularly if you go to the southwestern United States, Colorado Basin, and that area, those are desert habitats. But the parts of the southern Rocky Mountains also kind of speckles through the desert lowlands, and the top of the mountain peaks, the mountain pinnacle, is actually in very high elevation. So because of the altitudinal because of the high altitudes, they actually the temperature drops as it ascends, as the mountain ascends in elevation, and consequently creates this cold biomes, or cold alpine tundra biomes, and harboring lots of endemic species, particularly with respect to the mountains of the southwestern United States. There's a extremely rich diverse array of small mammals, rodents occupying those mountaintop environments. Pikas, for example, is kind of something I can think of right now. A similar situation occurs in isolated lakes, right? Isolated ancient lakes that actually have originated through the last glacial retreat are actually also homes for range restricted rare species. Particularly, the most ancient lakes exist in northern temperate Eurasia. Especially in the Russian landscape or Eurasian landscape, lakes like Lakes Baikal is home to many endemic freshwater fish, right? So those isolated lake basins that were created in the glacial retreat have remained isolated for a long time and have been created a long time ago. And the species that actually kind of colonized those habitats during the glacial retreat remained in isolation for a very long time and created these range restricted, geographically isolated rare species, or providing opportunity for evolution and speciation of range restricted rare species. And so like I mentioned before with respect to Venus flytrap, you could be looking at those these kind of narrow geographical ranges that is characteristic to rare species comes from very specialized habitat preferences. The examples I gave with regard to Venus flytrap is kind of the best example. Another situation, another example is this guy, Cape Sable seaside sparrow. Right? It's one of the subspecies of seaside sparrows, and kind of an easy way to remember that is Cape subspecies. Now, these guys, according to Endangered Species Act, they are listed as endangered as a subspecies, and Florida also lists within the state that species as endangered, and it's endemic to the Everglades. So you can actually see in this in my map that their range is restricted to this particular tiny corner. Okay. And now that's an extremely high level of habitat specializations, and and they occur in the Everglades environment, in that Everglades wetland environment. They occur in only in marshlands, right, along the Atlantic and the Gulf coasts, right. They don't occur anywhere else, because kind of if they do, they overlap with their with the ranges of other subspecies of the seaside sparrows. And also they have a very high degree of nest fidelity. So for nesting, they keep returning to the same habitats that they were born, right? So that actually restricts their habitat selection or alternative habitat choices, at least for nesting. And nesting is a very critical part of their reproductive fitness. So hence became a habitat specialist because of the very high degree of fidelity, not just to the Everglades, not just to the marshes in the Atlantic and the Gulf coasts, but to their specific natal grounds, right, for the purpose of nesting. Well, what else can we think about causes of habitat restrictions or causes of rarity? Small population sizes. Now, the example is this guy, right? That is the Iberian lynx, right? Well, you might recognize what part of the world I'm referring to if you know what Iberia is, or where Iberian Peninsula is, right? So Iberian lynx, it's kind of a bad question to ask, looking at these maps, to identify what global part of the world that we are looking at. In fact, we are looking at southern Europe, right? Particularly the Iberian Peninsula is the countries that includes Spain and Portugal collectively, right? So Iberian lynx is considered critically endangered in the global red list, and also listed in the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, CITES, right? It's a key rabbit predator, actually a rabbit specialist, which also is another interesting reason which actually creates rarity among species, right? And it also has really interesting habits. It not only predates rabbits, actually when it hunts rabbits, any extra kills it makes, it caches those, um, for future users. You don't see that kind of a behavior among many carnivores, right? And particularly not among small carnivores or medium-sized carnivores. So kind of an interesting behavior. Um, and historically, they were widespread throughout Iberian Peninsula, right, and kind of occurring throughout distributed in south of France. But today, um, they are kind of restricted to mostly to Spain, right, and largely within Spain. You can see how much their populations have been declining, right, since in 1900 pretty much broadly distributed throughout the Iberian Peninsula, south of France, right? So a greater distribution range. And then 1960s, you kind of immediately see within that 60-year time frame, it has declined, restricting into like a somewhat larger range in the southern Spain and few isolated population in elsewhere within the Iberian Peninsula, right? And it continued to deteriorate, and today you only have like two relatively robust populations, right? And one of them about over 100 individuals, another less than 100 individuals, right? And you can see both populations are severely female limited. Hence, you're looking at actually a dramatically plummeting reproductive fitness because the populations are female limited. So these guys, in terms of habitat selection, they are specialists of Mediterranean woodlands, as well as Mediterranean open scrublands, very unique and rare ecosystems, and those biomes themselves are naturally restricted in the Mediterranean realm, right? And these kind of habitats, you might think, wait a minute, there are other Mediterranean habitats. First of all, Mediterranean habitats at global scale are naturally rare, right? They do occur across global scale. There are ones in Africa. We have some in California and all the northern Africa and the southern Europe around Mediterranean Sea are also Mediterranean environments, but in each case they are extremely limited in geographical span, right? And even and specifically within around the Mediterranean Sea environment, they are also naturally limited, and other human activities like agriculture has further restricted the geographic span of the Mediterranean woodlands, particularly not just like crop farming, particularly free ranching cattle and many other animal husbandry activities have threatened these habitats. So now, on one side, like what actually, is responsible for their current small population size. They were not historically small in population size. They were geographically widespread, right? Still endemic to Iberian Peninsula, but widespread within the Iberian Peninsula, right? Today, extremely small fragmented populations, primarily driven by habitat loss, as I just explained, particularly with respect to animal farming and free cattle ranching. And secondarily, I mentioned that they are specialist predators of rabbits, right? And whatever threatens rabbits could threaten their survival. For example, myxoma virus. It's a virus that actually, naturally exists in European rabbit populations, right? And rabbit hemorrhagic disease have actually led to declining populations of rabbits. And these guys, being specialist predators of rabbits, they could not shift into another alternative prey, right? So hence led to their decline or reduced fitness at population scale. And then lynx have been also the subject of hunting, and also accidental killing of lynx in rabbit traps, particularly farmers set rabbit traps. Particularly, rabbits could be considered as an agricultural pest because rabbits are granivores and herbivores. So and lynx are not large cats, right? They are medium-sized to small-sized cats, so they actually could get inadvertently trapped in those traps set by farmers. And then, of course, the other accidental deaths, like certain farmers try to target fox, because fox could be predating on the livestock. So these guys could actually accidentally feed on baits laid for foxes, right? And also because of the fragmentation that evident through the maps, these cats actually require to roam large habitats, right? So with the fragmentation, these guys actually try to cross roads, highways, and they were subjected to incidental mortality by the means of road kills, which further led to declining populations, ultimately resulting in a smaller, tiny population of them, as you see in that map. Um, and also today, what we see is two remnant disjunct populations, right? And and there are several other species that could be locally abundant, locally in local environments. They occur in high numbers, in very stable populations, but they could be rare regionally or globally, right? Many species of amphibians, particularly salamanders, could belong to that particular category. And even there are several species of plants in particularly occurring in British Isles. There are many species of plants, herbaceous vegetation, that could be locally abundant, but they are rare at uh, the island scale within British geographies. And so this is actually creating an interesting challenge in terms of managing populations and habitats, because this kind of rare species, are strictly dependent on habitat management, enriching the habitat with increased favorability for them, and population management, where particularly like in areas where you're having smaller populations, like in the case of cables, the Cape subspecies of the seaside sparrow, Iberian lynx, are highly dependent on strategies that bolster their populations by captive breeding or foster caring, right? And we will go into some of those strategies later on. Um, Now, endemic species are naturally restricted to a particular geographical area, right? And if the geographical restriction is much more constricted in terms of the surface extent, you could end up with much more smaller populations where the number of individuals in that population is quite smaller. Mm. And with that, they're actually highly vulnerable to habitat loss. Um, and many species could also be broad-ranging species, meaning species that actually require a larger range area to maintain their biological activities. And for example, in the eastern deciduous forests, for example, have actually suffered in North America loss of about 90% of their original acreage. Imagine impact of that on species that actually were broad ranging in the eastern deciduous forests. Think about many songbirds that actually required a broader habitat range for their essential critical biological activities, and their um, and this kind of habitat loss could actually push a broad ranging species into a range restricted endemic. um, so like I mentioned, there are many species that actually went extinct in North America in the eastern deciduous forest. Particularly this kind of species loss could be traced back to the colonization of the Europe, right? European colonizers actually kind of started this pattern, and then from that point, it actually only got worse over time. Um, Wanted to talk about two forms of endemic. I think we did in a previous lecture with Dr. Paget. You might actually have heard about other forms of endemics. So neo-endemics and paleo-endemics. So what does those two terms mean? Neo-endemics are actually kind of meaning neo means novel, right? New endemics, meaning species that evolved recently, right? Range restricted, geographically restricted species that branched out recently in their evolutionary history. An example is what you're looking at right now, the African uh, lakefish belonging to the family Cichlidae, right? Cichlids in simple terms. actually have evolved fairly recently if you look at the time scale, right? I mean, we are looking at a fairly newer branches that evolved in the recent evolutionary history. Paleoendemics are species that actually where the other relatives have gone extinct. So they evolved a long time ago, and their other sister taxa, their other relative species have gone extinct, and consequently, the remnant species that are surviving today are actually long remnants, right, of historically or anciently diverse groups. Giant pandas is an example, right? All their other relatives, sister taxa, has gone extinct. So, where do you generally find endemics? You do find them in old lakes. It's a term that actually I brought up earlier, right? Particularly those northern Eurasian lakes that were formed historically by glacial retreats, is one location where you find a lot of endemic lake fish, right? Isolated islands, again, islands that were isolated way in the geological past in millions years ago tends to have more endemics. In fact, islands that isolated from the mainland once without repeated reconnection tend to have a greater level of endemism. Madagascar is a good example, and many islands in the south central Pacific have also have a very ancient geographic isolation. Um, Mountains that actually the high elevation bands of mountains are also areas where you have high endemism, because the reason is, it's difficult for a species that actually have survived the mountain top to descend the mountains, get into the deeper drier valleys and ascend another mountain. That's biologically impossible, because the drier xeric arid climate in the lower elevations of the mountain and the drier valleys are not conducive for their survival or for navigation to cross from one mountain top to another. And this is particularly applicable for highlands and mountains embedded in desert landscape, like in the southwestern United States, like I just mentioned. You can apply the same phenomena to the mountains of Southern America, of South America, particularly along the Atacama Desert. You still get the Andean mountain range, and the pinnacles of the Andean mountain range are actually home for many endemic species of plants. The same thing can be applied to isolated deep valleys, right? Particularly if the valley is extremely deep, it is impossible for the valley occupants to ascend the mountains and colonize those, because the mountains could be much more colder, where they experience a greater fluctuation in the environment. But the bottom of the valley could be actually more favorable and stable in terms of the thermal regimes. Ecoregions or biomes that are geographically old, geographically more ancient, also tend to have more endemic species, because in those biomes species have evolved in isolation for a very long time before other biomes evolved. Mediterranean landscapes are also considered among one of the most ancient biomes in the world. Particularly those of Australia are particularly important, because Australia isolated as a huge landmass from the rest of the Gondwana land, and the Mediterranean biomes formed are among one of the most ancient biomes within Australia. And I did refer to larger islands before, like Madagascar. And so this uh, map actually shows, how the ancient Gondwanaland continents became isolated. And you can see by 170 million years ago, almost all of the ancient the modern day continents of ancient Gondwana land actually have started to split apart, and you can clearly see that Madagascar is already isolated from Africa and Indian subcontinent. Similarly, New Guinea has already split from Australia about 170 million years ago. So those islands, right, will essentially, and you can see right over here, Sri Lanka has already isolated from India. But Sri Lanka and India remain connected through land bridges on multiple times. So Sri Lanka's isolation is not as dramatic as that of Madagascar or New Guinea, but New Guinea and Madagascar have much more prolonged isolation from their mainlands, which led to a greater degree of evolution of endemics in those unique environments. So let me take my pointer. All right, so what let's talk about different forms of vulnerabilities that is observed among species that kind of predisposes them to being rare. um, so in other words, what kind of species are more likely to become rare? um so I did mention earlier that certain species are naturally rare, and we did explain that with respect to habitat specialization or other resource specializations. And do not forget that human-induced activities, particularly overexploitation in forms of hunting and harvesting, can actually make a widespread common species rare. So that's one form. Another form is actually species that actually have large home ranges, right? So if a particular species has a large home range, they require large habitat areas, large landscapes, continuous landscapes, right? With human activities, that kind of large continuous landscapes are becoming much more rare, right, or less available, and that actually could lead to decline in that species. So something comparable is actually large-bodied species, right? Large-bodied species, particularly large mammals, especially large carnivores, require large territories, large ranges, large home ranges. And large-bodied species characteristically have lower reproductive rates. They reproduce infrequently, right? They have longer generation times. And they require very high energy demands, very high demand for food, right? They require a lot of calories to maintain their basal metabolic activities. To make all of these natural phenomena worse, large-bodied individuals of certain species are disproportionately targeted for trophy hunting, right? So, there are a combination of natural and human-driven predicaments that could make a particular species rare. So in this particular image, you are looking at two examples from North America and Australia, right? Where in North America, you are looking at mammoths, right? And as an example for one of the largest mammals known to roam North American landscapes, right? If you look at that particular figure on the x-axis, you are looking at body mass in terms of kilograms, and plotted against number of species on y-axis, right? And we clearly see that small-bodied animals, largely survived, in particularly this range, and kind of there is a threshold. If the body mass increases over 10 kilograms, right, there is a greater predisposition for their extinction. Large animals almost always, went extinct, right? So the green lines are actually the surviving proportions, shows the number of animals that are surviving, and the red bars superimposed on the green bars show extinctions, right? Clearly we can see the extinction risk or the extinction rates for small-bodied animals are extremely small compared to the proportion that are surviving. When you're looking at the large-bodied animals, clearly the number surviving is extremely small compared to the number that actually went extinct. And in certain cases, very extreme body sizes, we do not see any survival, right? Look at animals that are over 1,000 kilograms in body mass, right? You don't see any surviving individuals for that large body sizes. In Australia too, we kind of see the same pattern, but much more severe in terms of their extinction risks. At smaller mammals, right, you barely see any evidence for extinction. This is the only evidence of extinction I see for mammals, Australian mammals that are smaller than 10 kilograms in body size, right? That is the only sign of extinction, right? Mostly they actually survived. But look at body size is larger than 10 kilograms. When the body size is actually upwards of 100 kilograms, right, you see massive amount of extinction and very little survival, right? And a good example is, if you look at Tasmanian wolves, or thylacine, those are, large-bodied mammals, marsupials, large-bodied marsupials that actually completely have went extinct, in Australia. So, and also other characteristics that predisposes species to extinction is truly social groups, eusocial groups that require some sort of a kinship-based group aggregations for survival. Are predisposed for rarity, because if they don't have the eusociality, meaning like, adequate number of individuals grouping together with some kinship, well, that particular cohesion will collapse essentially, right? They will not behave cooperatively. That's why eusociality is so important for those social animals, right? They actually have to have a certain level of genetic relatedness. Without that, the cooperation breaks, shatters, and that will actually decline the individual level fitness. And same thing can be observed among other animals that perform group behaviors regardless of the relatedness. So in those ones, the individuals in the group doesn't have to be related to each other, right? But they require larger number of aggregations for them to survive. One of the examples I can think about is most North American and Northern European grazing herbivores like goats, antelopes, oryxes. Think about any grazing herbivorous mammal, large-sized mammal. They actually require extremely large herd sizes, right? And declining herd sizes actually declines their individual level fitness, right? And also those marine mammals and fish that actually behave in pods, right, are another good example that require cohesion of multiple individuals, right? These guys could actually, without the adequate numbers, they could actually they cannot behave as a single pod or a group if they don't have enough numbers. So hence that could kind of reduces the individual level survival. So looking at bottlenose dolphins and false killer whales. In fact, false killer whales require, do behave in or do exist in smaller numbers, but those groups that actually form smaller numbers don't make good group bonding, right? Their groups are transient, non-permanent. They don't do very well compared to false killer whales that actually exist in large numbers. Now, let's talk about a few things about bottlenecks. Dolphins, they are protected by Marine Mammal Protection Act. They are protected by Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species. They are a warm tropical species. And then false killer whales, they exist in both tropical and temperate environments, again protected by Marine Mammal Protection Act and CITES Convention. Um, um, let me see what are the examples I have up my sleeve. And also another example is actually antbird. It's a species that live in forests, and their diet is largely comprised of forest insects and many other non-insect arthropods that occupy the forest habitats. So the antbirds, when they feed in large numbers. So these guys, the antbirds, they feed in the understory and the midstory of the forest. And like I mentioned, they actually don't feed individually. They actually feed in flocks, mixed species feeding flocks. What do you mean by a mixed species feeding flocks? A feeding flock is a guild of bird species which comprises many different species behaving cohesively as a single unit, which we call a flock, right? And so a fifth species of this particular flock makes up the core membership, right? So they actually follow swarms of army ants, And what army ants do is they actually, when this army ants move, they actually displace, they kind of agitate other forest floor um, insects, small invertebrates, and kind of flush them out, right? So the so those flushed out insects and invertebrates are then predated by ant birds, right? So this is a really interesting situation. This is kind of a very interesting mutualistic relationship or a symbiotic relationship where the ant birds kind of piggyback on the behavior of the army ants to increase their foraging success. So this is a really interesting, weird situation where ant birds could be predisposed to rarity if the army ants decline in their abundance, right? Because if the army ants decline in their abundance, it decreases the army ants' ability to flush other insects from their environment, right? So that actually will impact ant birds. Secondarily, ant birds forage in groups of multiple species, not just multiple individuals of the same species, right? So the group cohesion cannot be maintained if you don't have this multi-member group, multi-species membership within the core of the flock, right? So all of those actually kind of pushes them towards rarity. Um, all right, moving on. So certain species are actually, poor in terms of dispersing, across different environments, leaving one habitat and, exploring another similar habitat and establishing that. That kind of ability is not observed in many different species, right? So a species that is unable to disperse from one habitat to another and establish there could also be predisposed to rarity. Right, so this could be attributed to many reasons, many biological factors. One, they may not have the physiological capacity or adaptive traits to facilitate dispersion or long distance migration, right? Or certain anthropogenic or cultural habitats like highways, roads, farmlands, human settlements, harvested timberlands could actually prevent dispersing of these individuals. So it's kind of an anthropogenic stress preventing them or making them poor dispersing agents, right? And also there are certain bird species and certain arboreal insects that do not travel through secondary forests, so secondary vegetation or degraded forest lands, right? And a good example is the non-flying mammals of Queensland rainforest. Queensland is actually a state within Australia. They actually do not they're pretty bad at kind of going through secondary forests, right? Flying mammals, yeah, they will fly over, but non-flying mammals, will not travel across secondary forests. In fact, some of those Queensland mammals do not even cross roads or other forms of fragmentation. It's kind of interesting. Sad, but interesting. Um, and also certain species could also dependent on other species through mutualistic interactions, right? And we did talk about this really interesting example with respect to army ants and the neotropical ant birds, right? If army ants decline, neotropical ant birds could also decline. And another example is actually these freshwater mussels of Mississippi and Ohio river basins, right? So by the way, the Mississippi-Ohio river basins are extremely rich in freshwater biodiversity, right? And they are exceptionally rich, being in a northern temperate ecoregion, right? Usually, you don't hear about northern temperates being, biodiversity hotspot. But in terms of freshwater biodiversity, Mississippi River Basin is extremely rich, particularly attributable to bivalve diversity in those ecosystems. Now, those freshwater mussels occurring in these freshwater systems are actually dependent on freshwater fish, right? So how so? Well, do mussels, like what kind of a thing do you think that a freshwater mussels require from a fish? Freshwater mussels have a complex life cycle. They have multiple larval stages, and some of those larval stages could be parasitic, right? So those parasitic mussel larval stages require to latch onto gills of freshwater fish in order to complete their life cycles. And we know that in freshwater river systems of North America, particularly in the Mississippi main stem and Ohio River in particular, fish populations, native fish populations are declining, right? So that could actually impact freshwater mussel populations because they cannot complete their life cycle, right? Two species that I can bring about here is ebony shell and the elephant ear mussels, right? So those guys require species like skipjack herring as a host for their larval stages, right? So what impacts skipjack herrings, or generally most of those migratory or diadromous fish, is actually dams, right? There are many rivers in the eastern as well as like western and pretty much throughout the country. Many of the freshwater river systems are no longer free flowing, they are dammed, right? For reservoir construction, for variety of purposes, for hydroelectric generation, for water supply, for irrigation, you name it. So this kind of dam construction prevents migration of fish, and as a result, some of those other invertebrates that depend on those fish could actually also suffer decline. So, what are the specific features that makes species vulnerable, particularly rare species, vulnerable to extinction? Species that actually have seasonal migration patterns that require or depends on seasonal migration, right? Because those species require two or more habitats to complete their life histories. So for example, for those migratory species migrate for multiple or variety of purposes, could be in search of better optimal breeding grounds, where they could actually gather enough resources to look after their young, to feed their young. It also could be for the purpose of avoiding severe winter, for the purpose of overwintering, and in certain cases in search of better foraging grounds, right, to increase their survival and growth, or to ensure this better survival and better initial growth conditions for their offspring. So if any migratory species suffer habitat loss anywhere within its migratory range, that could make them vulnerable to extinction, right? This could also be a problem with their migratory pathway. If anything changes in their in the landscape along which they migrate, you could suffer habitat loss. If habitat loss happens, if a particular migratory species loses landscape connectivity across their migratory pathway, that could lead to that could predispose them towards extinction. Dams declining in construction of dams have resulted in massive declining in many types of diadromous fish species. Diadromous, what do you mean by diadromous? Diadromous means or stands for fish that migrate between saltwater and freshwater environments for the purpose of reproduction, right? Or species that spend different life stages between freshwater and marine environments. So these kind of migratory species will cross multiple international borders, right? Particularly birds do that, and in certain cases, marine turtles cross international borders. Particularly in the if you look at the African coast, southern African coast, right? There are certain endangered marine turtles that actually lay eggs in transboundary coastal environments. And the map you see to my right is actually the migratory pathway of Siberian crane, which is considered critically endangered, and that today survive in three different populations corresponding to these three migratory pathways or migratory corridors, right? So you can see that. So what requires for the migration, successful completion of the migratory path of the Siberian crane? Well, presence of intact aquatic and wetland habitats, right? So you can see that, clearly there are, during their migration, these species, these birds cross multiple international borders, right? If you look at the westernmost population, sorry, the easternmost population over here, well, they are the countries that involves their migratory pathway, or the migratory path that is crisscrossed by this population, is taking part in wetland conservation projects, right? So it's great. And even better, if you look at these red squares, that actually indicates specific sites that these cranes use, these areas are also a part of the wetland conservation project, right? So that ensures the protection and the longevity of that particular species, that particular population. But now let's look at these western populations. Look at the southernmost distribution and distribution, right? None of these countries, the South Asian and Central Asian, Middle Eastern countries, are actually taking part in wetland conservation, right? The only country that actually takes part in only Middle Eastern country that apparently takes part in wetland conservation is Iran, right? But look at their migratory pathway, right? They have to crisscross Azerbaijan, that does not take part in wetland conservation. So unless all of these countries, South Asian, Central African, South Asian, Central Asian plus Middle Eastern countries, unless all of them collaborate in these wetland conservation projects, you may not ensure the longevity or the persistence of these western populations of Siberian crane. And also, I earlier mentioned there are effective wetland conservation actions taking place in the eastern population, right? And apparently all the countries are colored in green, okay? So they are taking part in active wetland restoration and conservation. But one of the river systems these birds follow in particularly in China, which actually comprises more than half of their migratory trajectory, include the Yangtze River, which is one of the most severely impacted, modified, polluted waterway, right, in the world, right? So in order to, and their northernmost boundary is the northeastern Siberia, right? So before reaching that, they actually kind of, follows the Yangtze River for a very long distance, and that river is among the most imperiled state. So and the other thing is actually, if you look at the other central population over here, right, which actually also is dependent on, also migrates along a river corridor, right? So just site-specific wetland conservation, where you have stopovers, is not enough. You need to actually protect this entire river basins, this entire river corridors has to be protected, which includes protection of the river channel as well as the riparian environment. And some of those river systems actually crisscrosses multiple national boundaries, right? So you need to actually implement conservation of rivers, particularly transboundary rivers, should be prioritized for conservation if you are worrying about conservation of these migratory species, right? And so particularly habitat loss is happening throughout this particular range, right? And throughout the range of these populations, particularly in the western and the central populations, right? And hydrologic modification is prevalent in Chinese waterways, right? And in the South Asian and Central Asian environments, most of those wetland habitats are dramatically modified and drained for agriculture, right? And in some of those western and central populations, their migratory path overshadows on countries that are actually suffering from civil unrest. So those countries don't actually care about conservation, unfortunately. So which could render all conservation efforts useless. Let's continue on to other factors that predispose rare species to extinction. we did revisit these concepts earlier on, but species that form or live in large aggregations, roosting bats is a great example. Um, Herds of bisons, birds that forage in flocks, single species flocks as well as multi-species flocks. Passenger pigeons are known to form monospecific flocks in large numbers, and some of the historical chronicles suggest that when they fly, it kind of looks like a dark cloud hovering over the sky. Um, and spawning ocean fish also makes this humongous schooling aggregates that actually, synchronously aggregate in spawning grounds for the purpose of egg laying. Um, Migrating species like alewives and salmon are also known to migrate in large numbers synchronously. So aggregates kind of attracts hunters. That's what happens here, right? Particularly, bats are hunted for their flesh. You've heard about these, soups that people make out of bats, and the consequences of eating bats, right? I mean, we do suspect there are many diseases that actually became global pandemics when you consume those wild or bush meat. Now, that aside, in the history of human civilization, humans tend to focus on aggregating species as a food source, right? And all of the animals I mentioned before, were hunted simply because it's easy to hunt them when you can actually simply kill so many by just, being at the right place at the right time. Right, and also the other disadvantage is if you're looking at a species that exist or live in aggregates, diseases can spread faster. That's why white nose syndrome is such a big problem for roosting bats, right? They look at my diagram on the top, right? My photograph on the top, that's gray meiotis. That's actually how they den, right? Literally, they are packed in very close contact to each other. Right, so white nose can actually spread. The fungus can spread very easily from one to the other. Right, diseases are density dependent mortality factors or density dependent regulators. Parasites, disease pathogens can spread really fast in that kind of high density aggregates and result in massive mortality. Species that particularly did not have prior human contact are also susceptible to extinction because they do not consider humans as a threat or as a predator. Dodo is a good example. They evolved in an environment that actually did not have predators, right? So they do not elicit any predator, anti-predator, counter-predator response or any predator avoidance. So actually they became easy targets for early Polynesians, and on the other hand, certain wildlife that co-evolved for a long period of time with humans or even pre-Homo sapien anthropoids, they actually evolved counter adaptations, particularly to avoid being hunted by humans, right? So it's kind of interesting, like, certain, particularly if you can think about the African megafauna, right? They are very well evolved, very well adapted to avoid human contact. But still, strangely enough, despite that, of course, there are certain, many African mega wildlife or megafauna are also suffering extinction risks due to other factors. But there are studies showing that some of those actually have evolved adaptive responses to avoid human conflicts. Interesting. Seems like you cannot get away from one of the worst species to roam the planet, fucking humans. Um, and also species that are dependent on grasslands, particularly in European environments, could actually also suffer comparatively more towards extinction. Uh, for example, the European landscape, the grasslands that occur in high acidic environments, those that occur in high altitudes, those grasslands could be easily encroached by by woody trees and kind of convert the scrubland grassland environment into woodlands or forests, right? Because the reason is historically those European grasslands, scrublands, evolved as a consequence of grazing with low density grazing with human livestock. So the wildlife co-evolved to inhabit those habitats, particularly birds, right? Now when you actually um, currently if you actually remove the grazing pressure, or if those extensive low intensity grazing is, if that is not happening, if that is replaced with industrial grade ranching, then you actually lose those really cool grassland ecosystems, and concomitantly you lose species adapted to live in those grasslands, which could be those herbaceous vegetation that can only occur in those environments, because most of those herbs and grasses are shade intolerant. If they were to be invaded by forest trees or woody vegetation, those grasses could be easily outcompeted by overshading.